began with a photograph. Curled at the edges, the sepia print had been sealed inside an envelope marked undeliverable in a forgotten drawer of Boston's East Cambridge post office. The postmark read, November 1889. In the image, faint, nearly faded, a woman in a high-necked morning gown stared toward the photographer with strange intensity. Behind her left shoulder was what at first looked like a drape, until one noticed the shape inside it. A human shape. A hand, pale and inert, extending just beneath the fabric. When the clerk, a man named Harold Beckett, turned the photo over, he saw only 5 words penciled in tight, delicate handwriting. She only smiles when they're still. Beckett's discovery would, within days, unearth a string of unclaimed bodies left across the city's wharfside lodging houses and rented attics. Each victim lay arranged as though sleeping beside some invisible companion, lips tinged blue, with no signs of struggle. Doctors whispered of poisoning, perhaps gas. The newspapers, eager for pity and outrage, invented a nickname before the police could form a theory: the Widow of Joy Street. But the truth was filthier and far more intimate than anyone suspected. Her story, and the city that shaped her, would stain Boston's respectable facade with whispers of obsession, death, and desire. For months, the pulpit and the press would argue over whether her acts were madness, possession, or something darker still. A hunger not of flesh, but of stillness. Before we continue with the story of the Widow of Joy Street, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1889, and Boston stood at the uneasy intersection of glory and decay. The wealthy families who'd built their fortunes on whaling, railroads, and theology were fencing off their neighborhoods with iron gates. Beacon Hill glowed each evening with gaslight flickers shining on waxed carriages, while the North End reeked of cod, horses' sweat, and coal smoke. The streets thrummed with the clatter of trolley wheels, the muffled cries of fishmongers, the clang of factory bells calling the poorer classes back into soot-filled brick halls. Winter came early that year, the kind that froze the harbor in sheets and drove even the toughest longshoremen indoors. On nights like those, fog from the Charles mingled with chimney soot until the city seemed suspended between sea and smoke. Ragged children swept the streets for pennies in boarding houses along Tremont and Washington streets. Men coughed through their 3rd tumbler of gin, while upstairs their wives stitched handkerchiefs by candlelight and whispered prayers to saints who never answered. Beneath this industrious hum was a moral fever, the clash between Enlightenment optimism and the Gothic fear that still roosted in Protestant bones. A decade earlier, Boston had watched the tail end of the spiritualist craze sweep through its parlors. Seances, spirit photographs, mourning jewelry filled with human hair. The city's high-born widows had learned to flirt with the supernatural the way they flirted with stockbrokers and clergymen. Death itself had become a social performance. In newspapers like the Boston Globe and the Evening Transcript, murder was sold beside advertisements for corsets and cough syrups. The educated believed in progress. The poor believed in curses. And in between those worlds moved women, educated enough to read dime novels that romanticized violence, yet trapped by corseted expectations that denied them touch, pleasure, or freedom. Doctors of the age diagnosed such women with hysteria. The prescription, appallingly common, was removal from stimulation. Darkened rooms, moral therapy, cold baths. Some whispered of new clinics experimenting with vibrations and electricity. Behind closed parlor doors, respectable physicians treated the female body as mystery and menace alike. Against this suffocating backdrop, one woman, whose name society would scrawl in 1,000 sensational headlines, decided to make her own experiment unlicensed and unspeakable. Yet, before the tabloids ever hinted at her, She was just another face in the crowd, seen, forgotten, and reappearing wherever death followed. By the autumn of 1889, the working-class tenements along Joy Street, just off Beacon Hill, were swollen with migrants from Ireland and Portugal. Candle smoke warmed the stale air, mingled with the sharp tang of tanneries along the water. Behind shuttered windows, laundry flapped in the damp breeze, each sheet half illuminated by the glow of nearby gas lamps that hissed with a faint metallic sting. Children with soot-ringed eyes raced barefoot through alleys, their laughter cut short whenever the constable's lantern swept the corners. It was in that labyrinth of boarding houses that the first whisper began. A landlady's story about a refined lady lodger who always paid in cash and insisted her room be locked from both sides. The lady kept the curtains drawn at all hours and refused housekeeping services. Each evening a man would visit, and each morning when the landlady brought tea, the guest would be gone and the room would smell faintly of carbolic acid. But poison leaves its odor in the walls. While the city prided itself on transcendental ideals and liberal education, it also harbored an obsession with control, with sanitizing the human condition. In the lecture halls of Harvard Medical School, professors cautioned their young men about the deceptive nature of female nerves. Physicians debated whether moral corruption could be diagnosed through the complexion. To them, crime was a symptom, not an act, arising from degeneracy of blood and temperament. And still, the streets pulsed with contradiction. Immigrant crowds spilled from Catholic churches under marble effigies of the Virgin, while 2 blocks away, Unitarians preached reason and moderation. Sailors loitered outside opium dens on Portland Street. Suffragists passed out pamphlets demanding equality, and the city's elite held charity galas where gilded candlesticks reflected every sin money could polish. Boston, in 1889, was a tightening corset of respectability stretched over appetites it refused to name. The police, still wrestling with new ideas of forensic science, relied more on witnesses and confessions than on evidence. Blood patterns were gossip. Psychology was a sermon topic. And amidst these contradictions, it was disturbingly easy for a murderer to pass as a lady, so long as her manners were precise and her gloves clean. That winter, the harbor ice cracked earlier than usual. A fisherman pulling his nets near the Charlestown Bridge found something tangled in the ropes. A single silk glove, lilac-colored. Its seams split, but the fabric pristine. Inside it, astonishingly, the flesh of a woman's hand. Still pale, chilled as porcelain, the nails perfectly trimmed. Within hours, police traced the glove's make to a shop on Tremont Street frequented by upper-class customers. The mark of a monogram, faded but legible, read IV. Reporters had their field day. Mysterious hand found in harbor, belongs to lady of means, screamed the headlines. The public devoured the story. Society columns speculated whether the victim, or culprit, was one of their own. The sickly excitement mirrored another fear, that vice had infiltrated the very households held up as pillars of moral order. For the investigators, it started as a curiosity. For one particular journalist, it became a lifelong obsession. His name was James Harrow, a reporter from the Boston Daily Advertiser. Former soldier, failed theologian, and son of a North End undertaker, Harrow possessed an eye for contradictions, a willingness to descend into streets where language loosened and truth grew teeth. He'd covered fires, riots, factory collapses, but none of it prepared him for the figure the city would learn to dread. He first heard her name not from the police, but from an undertaker's apprentice who claimed unusual deliveries were being made. Solitary female clients arriving at midnight, requesting private viewings of the newly dead. One night, the apprentice told him, a woman had entered wearing a black traveling cloak and a perfume of violet water. She selected one corpse and, after he'd left her alone, out of what he later called Christian courtesy, she lingered longer than any mourner. When he returned, she was gone, and the corpse had been moved. The head turned gently toward the door, its lips parted as though mid-sigh. In an era that prized discretion, such stories rarely reached print. But Harrow kept the rumor in his notebook, which by 1889 was swollen with similar oddities. A morgue attendant dismissed for improper behavior toward a female visitor. Whispers from the docks about women seen carrying heavy trunks at odd hours. A clergyman's sermon railing against pleasures that mocked the pulse of the living. Each clue meant nothing alone. Together they mapped a silhouette, a specter in silk gloves walking among them. Boston could not imagine that the city's next season of scandal would not involve politics or class warfare, but desire, the forbidden kind that robbed breath rather than shared it. By night, gas lights drew halos around every secret. In Beacon Hill mansions, ladies played Chopin on parlor pianos while their husbands glanced toward the door, minds on business deals and mistresses. On the riverbank, coal barges creaked as if exhaling under the weight of unspoken confessions. There, somewhere amid the fog-slicked docks, the widow prepared her next visitation. History, of course, never shows us monsters without showing us the world that made them necessary. Boston's moral rigidity gave birth to transgressors hungry for sensation, while its prudish silence silenced those who sought help. The emerging theories of sexuality and psychology, then whispered in European circles, had barely touched the Puritan conscience of New England. Yet behind these closed doors flickered a new understanding, unspoken but felt. The human soul, like the city itself, could rot from within, while the exterior remained spotless. Against this backdrop of reform and repression, the widow of Joy Street was not merely a killer. She was the exhalation of a collective sickness, the body of Boston made visible. And it all began, officially, with that chilled sepia photograph lying beneath the post office lamp, a ghost caught admiring herself beside her own still creation. There are murderers whose names pass like gusts, momentary, vile, and soon forgotten. And then there are those whose shadows become architecture. Eleanor Vale belonged to the latter kind. The earliest trace of her appeared in the parish register of St. Ignatius, winter of 1852, christened Eleanor Clare Vale, daughter of Francis Vale and Margaret Ney Dupré. Her father, a watchmaker from the South End, was known for two traits, precision and silence. Her mother, French-born and rumored to have once sung in parlors across Montreal, died before Eleanor turned 12. According to an old family account, the death shook her father's mind. From that year onward, he conversed more with his clocks than with his neighbors. Eleanor grew up in that rhythm of ticking and loss. Even as a child, she startled those around her with her calm. A cousin later told a reporter she never wept at funerals. She watched like someone timing the end. When she was 17, she entered the Boston Female Medical College, a short-lived institution allowing women to train as physicians. There she learned anatomy. Pallid cadavers stretched upon marble slabs, the scent of formaldehyde so thick it rode home with her in her hair. One instructor, Dr. Hiram Bell, recalled her rare composure. Miss Vale, he said in a recovered interview years later, was untroubled by the spectacle. Most faint at the first incision, she asked for sharper instruments. It was Bell who first noticed her fascination with the heart, not metaphorically, but the muscle itself. Her notebook survived, filled with sketches of ventricles and arteries labeled in delicate copperplate. In the margins, she wrote, "The cessation is perfection, each beat a bruise upon eternity." Her classmates nicknamed her Saint Stillness, a mockery of her poise. Yet her letters from that period show a woman violently aware of constraint. "They tell us," she wrote to a friend, "that God requires female modesty. But modesty is only fear-wearing perfume. I think I was born without that fear." After college, Eleanor vanished from public record for nearly a decade. When she reappeared in 1887 as a traveling nurse attached to the Women's Temperance Relief Society. She carried letters of recommendation impeccably forged in a widow's costume. Black silk, jet buttons, a small cross pinned just above the heart. No one asked whose widow she was. In Boston, bereavement commanded respect. There were others caught in her orbit, some by curiosity, others by desire. Among them, Detective Marshal Henry Leland, a man who believed morality could be measured by ledger and lamp. Leland was 43, his beard neatly trimmed, his boots perpetually clean despite the city's filth. He lived alone in a rented room near Government Center with 2 habits: black coffee and midnight patrols. His colleagues called him steady, though his journals later revealed obsession. The Leland diaries, preserved in the state archives, record his first encounter with Eleanor Vale during a charity event at King's Chapel. He described her as a woman of 35, perfectly dressed, complexion near translucent, with eyes that refused light but reflected movement. They spoke briefly that night. Leland: "Pardon, madam, are you one of the nurses from the Temperance Society?" Eleanor: "I am all manner of nurse, sir, body and soul alike. Which ailment troubles you?" He wrote that her voice cut like a scalpel wrapped in silk. From that evening on, he followed her quiet trail through the city's dispensaries and boarding houses, sometimes arriving hours too late, after a patient expired, inexplicably serene, a faint smile fixed upon the lips. In court testimony years later, Leland admitted a confusion that still haunted him. "I could not tell whether I pursued her for justice or for understanding. Perhaps both were the same disease in me." Then there was James Harrow, the journalist who would immortalize the case. To hear him tell it, he was less man than medium. Someone who listened for stories that refused burial. He had the sharp cheekbones of a scholar gone to seed, and a voice perpetually rough from chimney smoke and cheap whiskey. Unlike Leland, who sought order, Harrow thrived in chaos, filling notebooks with every superstition overheard in taverns and alleyways. He first published mention of the mysterious widow before the police even recognized a pattern. In an article titled "Death's Mistress Among Us," he described the phenomenon of women visiting the dying to collect their last sighs. Circulation doubled overnight. When the paper demanded a follow-up, Harrow plunged back into the rumor mill, knowing he was feeding both hysteria and truth. 2 months later, he received a letter written on heavy ivory stationery, smelling faintly of violet. "Aye, Mr. Harrow, you write of things you hardly believe. Come to Joy Street on Friday at 9. I shall grant you a demonstration. No harm if your faith is firm. E.V." He kept the letter folded in his coat for weeks, alternately terrified and intoxicated. He eventually confessed to a friend. "I think she corresponds with me as the devil corresponded with Job, for amusement." But this is not only Eleanor's story. There were victims, men whose names line the coroner's ledgers like forgotten verses. The first identified was Joseph Pritchard, a dockhand and occasional fiddler, age 28. Those who knew him described him as cheerful, fond of drink and sea shanties. His wife, a laundress, told investigators he had met a refined lady who promised employment aboard a relief ship bound for Halifax. The evening before he vanished, Pritchard stopped at the Bell Anchor pub. Witnesses later recalled a peculiar exchange. "Barkeep: 'Another round, Joe. You'll drown before you sail.' Pritchard: 'Can't linger. She waits by the chapel. Says she's sending me to honest work.' Barkeep: 'A lady sending you anywhere? That's tomfool midnight talk.' Pritchard: 'Then call me fool come morning.' Morning found only his boots stacked neatly by the wharf and his cap drifting near the dock pilings. Another, Dr. Benjamin Niles, belonged to Boston's intellectual elite, a physician lecturing on nerve disorders. Several of his female patients had reported new treatment methods, inspired by continental research. When he was discovered dead in his Beacon Hill apartment, Local papers hinted at suicide, though no poison was found. Leland's private notes reveal that Niles had reorganized his will a week prior, leaving an uncharacteristic bequest to Mrs. E. Vale, in gratitude for revelations of a most personal nature. And still the case grew murkier. Each death followed a pattern as invisible as perfume. Men and women taken at moments of deep loneliness, veterans, widowers, incurable patients, all found with expressions of some serene release. Eleanor was said to have visited them under different names: Mrs. Vane, Miss Eleonora, the widow of Joy Street. Each persona dressed identically: the black silk, the polished gloves, the scent of violet. The press ballooned her into myth. Illustrations in the Boston Globe depicted her as a pale siren hovering above her victims, a spectral nurse conducting mercy killings for pleasure. Religious leaders raged against her as an abomination born of modern godlessness. Feminist reformers, conversely, whispered admiration for a woman who navigated freedom so ruthlessly. Meanwhile, Detective Leland's partner, Constable Samuel Ryan, struggled to reconcile duty with superstition. He was Irish-born, devoutly Catholic, given to crossing himself at the mention of the widow's name. Ryan: maybe she's just death walking in a lady's bones. Leland: death doesn't rent a room and pay cash. Ryan: maybe it does. These days death's got fine manners. That exchange, recorded in a Herald feature 2 years later, became emblematic of the city's unease, whether they hunted a murderer or something less mortal. Eleanor's physical description varies depending on who survived to describe her. Some remembered her beauty, others her stillness, but all noted the same contradictions: her lips colorless yet moist, her gaze detached yet intimate. When she entered a room, the temperature seemed to drop by a degree. She was not theatrical, not the stereotype of a madwoman. She simply existed as if entirely at peace in a world vibrating with unrest. In an age when women were taught to hide emotion, her calm read as either saintly or monstrous. Witness Sarah McKenna, a chambermaid at the boarding house where one body was found, told the inquest, "I thought she was a widow indeed. She carried such sorrow about her. But when she looked at him on the bed she smiled, and that smile near froze me, like she'd waited years just for that quiet." Eleanor Vale appeared at every cultural fault line of her century, the collision between science and faith, medicine and morality, lust and sanctity. Her story opens the scene within Victorian virtue itself, a time when death was domestic, respectable, and photographed beside the living as memento. She merely blurred the boundary further. When Harrow at last gathered the courage to visit Joy Street after her letter, the lodger who answered swore no one by that name resided there, but he found, under the door of room 6, a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a pressed violet, a curl of black hair, and a calling card that read simply, "For your next edition." He never slept through a night again. From that moment forward, both Harrow and Leland moved through Boston as twin investigators, the reporter chasing symbols, the detective chasing evidence. Above them, the city continued its routines: carriages splitting puddles, choir boys rehearsing hymns, snow darkening on cobblestones. Beneath their feet, in crypts and surgery halls, the new science of pathology sought to explain life by dissecting death. Eleanor Vale would offer a demonstration no one could forget. The people who knew her glimpsed gentle gestures, sometimes even kindness. A neighbor recalled her reading scripture to a sick child in hushed tones. Yet, when pressed, the memory twisted. She read the story of Lazarus, the neighbor said. Then she whispered, "What a pity he came back." Those words would echo through the trial that followed, through sermons and editorials, until the line blurred between blasphemy and truth. For in some unthinkable way, Eleanor believed she was giving mercy, the only lasting serenity she had ever learned. And somewhere in her inherited madness, born of clocks and silence, she mistook the absence of breath for love fulfilled. The era that produced her could not admit its complicity. It would rather invent demons than examine the cages it built around a woman's own body. To understand Eleanor Vale is to understand Boston itself at the end of the century, civilized, educated, yet so repressed it nurtured its own monster. As the winter of 1889 deepened and another body surfaced behind the Union Oyster House, the pattern became undeniable. Detective Leland at last requested a formal task force. Harrow sharpened his quills. The church bells tolled as ever, untroubled, and someone, perhaps Eleanor herself, slipped beneath the city's gaslight with a doctor's precision and a lover's patience, preparing the next stillness. The first tremors of dread didn't arrive with screaming headlines or public hysteria. They came softly, like a draft creeping under a door, almost polite. Before anyone whispered, "widow," before Eleanor Vale's name rippled through Boston's gossiping parlors, there were simply oddities that respectable citizens tried not to notice. In November 1888, a trolley driver reported a woman standing motionless beside the common well after curfew, bareheaded in the drizzle, gloved hands folded neatly before her, staring down at her own reflection in a puddle. When he called to her, she blinked once, slowly, as if surfacing from a dream, then turned and walked away. He swore she left no footprints behind her on the damp cobblestone. The constable dismissed it as imagination brewed by exhaustion and gin. That same month, infirmary staff at the city hospital noted a rise in deaths among terminal patients. Peaceful, sudden, all occurring sometime after evening devotions. One nurse remarked that some corpses seemed oddly composed, hands crossed with intention, expressions serene. "It is as though someone had arranged them for a photograph," murmured the matron. But there had been no photographers present, only the quiet lull of midnight. Strange letters began appearing in the advertiser's office, unsigned, written in a fine, steady cursive. They described a lady in mourning visiting those near death to relieve them of their suffering. One claimed she wore violets pinned to her veil. Another asserted she carried an apothecary's case hidden under her cloak. Harrow read them out loud in the newsroom, half laughing, though the sound carried more curiosity than amusement. "Apparently," he said to his editor, "Boston has acquired a ghost with a medical license." "Print it, but make it tasteful," came the reply. "We'll call her an angel of mercy." The term stuck. For weeks, it sold an extra 1,000 copies a day. Boston's nights, that winter before the storm, grew heavier than usual. The North End was drowning in fog and unemployment. Gas lamps hissed like slow breathing. Alley cats moved as if wary of something unseen. Dock workers who spent their lives amidst clamor began avoiding the narrow lanes behind Joy Street, claiming, "The air there feels watched." A boy named Tommy Byrne, age 12, claimed to have seen a woman blacker than shadow, slipping out from the charnel house behind the old almshouse. When questioned, he insisted she carried a black doctor's bag and hummed, though he couldn't name the tune. The constable cuffed him for lying. Yet, 2 weeks later, that same constable was found fainted dead drunk behind a grocer's, muttering about a pale hand on the latch, cold as fish. At the time, no one linked these episodes. Desperation stoked imagination. The city offered plenty of both. But for Detective Leland, the pattern swelled like a tide he couldn't ignore. Every report, trivial, anonymous, shared a kernel of the same unnerving precision. He started walking the streets alone after midnight, noting where gaslights flickered most, as though the city itself suffered from arrhythmia. On one such patrol near Mount Vernon Street, he spotted a figure at the gate of the cholera cemetery. The veil fluttered. The form within moved neither timidly nor swiftly, but with an elegance that denied fear. Leland approached, calling, "Madam, this is no hour for prayer." The woman turned. He later described her face as featureless in that fog, yet her voice, soft, assured, cut through the air clean as surgery. "Inspector," she said, though he'd given no name, "you mistake devotion for trespass. The living need rest far more than the dead." He reached for his lantern, but the glass chimed with a sudden frost. When he blinked, she was gone, footprints vanishing halfway down the path. In his case journal, he scribbled one line, "She knows me." Meanwhile, in the hospital wards, whispers curdled into fear. A patient named Agnes Hollings, convalescing from a failed operation, swore a nurse had visited her in the night, whispering psalms at her ear. "She prayed so sweetly I near wanted to go," Agnes told another nurse. "Then I opened my eyes and saw she wasn't moving her lips at all." The attending physician laughed it off as delirium, but the next evening Agnes Hollings died in her sleep, smiling faintly, 2 violet petals resting on her pillow. The staff argued over how they'd got there, but no record listed them among the hospital's supplies. When Harrow caught wind of the rumors, he began compiling obituaries by hand, cross-referencing the quietly dignified deaths that never made sensational copy. One night, in his boarding room thick with tobacco haze, he addressed Detective Leland through the only medium a reporter trusted, gossip. "Harrow, seems our angel of mercy favors those beyond all suspicion, the hopeless, the unwanted, efficient way to practice without license. Leland, you believe she's genuine?" "Harrow, I believe Boston invents angels easier than it buries sins." They decided, not officially but with that grim partnership of convenience common between press and police, to watch for her. If she indeed walked the night, she would leave some trace, however faint. What neither man grasped then was how deeply the widow's presence had already infiltrated the city's psychology. Sermons in Baptist pulpits began warning against unnatural comfort in death. Spiritualist circles, still active in Beacon Hill parlors, claimed the city vibrated with heightened energy, as if the boundary between mortality and peace had thinned. Patients in asylums repeated prayers to a black nurse who promised healing through perfect quiet. And then came the incident at the Surgeon's Apprenticeship Hall. On March 4th, 1889, students at Harvard's medical department prepared a demonstration for visiting dignitaries. Among the cadavers was that of a middle-aged man, unidentified, received from the county morgue under ordinary circumstance. Before the lecture began, the attendants discovered something chilling. The corpse had been freshly washed, the lips coated in rosewater, the body laid out precisely, not their work. Someone, perhaps the night before, had tended to him with tenderness. A faint perfume of violets lingered. The dean dismissed it as a morbid jest. Some students' romantic nonsense. Yet the apprentices whispered another name, the widow. Within days, the afflicted rumor infected the entire dissection hall. A change settled over everyone handling the dead. Laughter dimmed, glances darted. Men who'd once joked about corpses now stepped around them with uneasy caution, as if unseen eyes observed from within the slabs. Boston's tone itself began shifting. Newspapers, sensing blood and readership, printed tales with whispering bravado. The Lady of Quiet Death, Mercy in Mourning Vale. Women readers were divided between horror and something darker, fascination. Some left violets at church altars, some burned them. The city's men reacted with indignation masked as righteousness. Editorials railed against female influence in medical curiosity and woman's trespass into the sanctum of life and death. Every anonymous column about the widow was also a scolding for women's advancement. Every sermon a disguised panic that the gentle sex might acquire appetite. In that climate, Eleanor Vale, or the woman they presumed her to be, sank further into myth. She no longer needed to stalk alleys. The fog itself conjured her likeness. Every echo belonged to her. There was one episode, half lost to history, that proved far less spectral. On a frigid March evening, a constable named Patrick Morey claimed to have caught the widow outright. Called to the docks by dock workers alarmed at a figure dragging a trunk toward the river, he arrived to find a woman alone. Hands gloved, trunk half open beside her boots. "Evening, madam," he said, attempting gallantry. "Rough night for moving." She looked up with a smile so faint he nearly apologized. Inside the trunk was a young man's body, neatly arranged as if prepared for voyage. Shaved, dressed, eyes sealed with an unknown adhesive substance that left no bruise. The air smelled not of decay, but of cologne. Morey took a step back and stammered, "You'll answer for this." The woman tilted her head. He prayed for peace. I granted it. Then, according to his shaken statement the next morning, a gust of fog rolled in from the quay. When it cleared, both woman and trunk were gone. Only the throttled echo of gulls remained. By dawn, Constable Morey had resigned his post and taken the first train to Maine, refusing to explain further. Why? As these incidents accumulated, the tone of Boston grew uneasy in ways even daylight couldn't mend. Shopkeepers claimed business slowed after dusk. Sailors refused to dock alone. Churches saw larger congregations at funerals than at weddings. Gaslight began to symbolize not comfort but surveillance, each lamp a futile defense against the veil. Detective Leland resumed his nightly routes, though he confessed in letters to a colleague that the widow had infiltrated his dreams. He dreamt of clock hands stopping mid-tick, of voices whispering through linen, of sitting beside a woman with pale fingers and feeling thankful for silence. Leland, man of reason, was succumbing to the very disease he hunted: fascination. Harrow, for his part, turned the phenomenon into literature. His articles oscillated between disgust and near reverence, each line feeding the myth he claimed to expose. One night, drunk on victory and fear, he muttered to his printer, "Her murders are sermons, Tom. The city listens better to horror than to sermons about poverty." The printer replied quietly, "Aye, but whose gospel do we print?" By spring, nothing in Boston breathed quite right. The air seemed thinner, the hospital bells tolled more often. Strange coincidences multiplied, streetlights dimming as choirs rehearsed requiems, crows gathering on roofs near Joy Street, children complaining of lullabies hummed by an unseen woman outside their shutters. And then, the nurses' strike. At the Women's Temperance Relief Clinic, attendants refused night duty after one of their own, Miss Mary Coyle, was found asleep beside a patient's corpse, her pulse erratic as though she'd nearly joined him. In her grasp lay a violet crushed into pulp. When revived, she swore she'd seen the widow's face leaning over mine as gentle as prayer. After that, no one entered the ward after 8. It was this unrest that finally convinced the mayor's office to authorize Leland's request for a formal investigation. What began as rumor became an official matter of public safety. Reporters scented scandal. Preachers scented damnation. Families locked their doors, though doors mean little to phantoms or clever killers. The Boston Daily Advertiser printed one last speculative headline before the veil tore completely in: "Mercy or Murder? Who walks among the dying of Joy Street?" It would be the line that tethered the city's mounting dread to a name. And the next death, unlike the quiet ones before, would come not wrapped in serenity, but blood and hysteria, forcing Boston to confront that its angel of mercy was neither angel nor merciful. The breaking point came on May 11th, 1889. That evening began like any other, warm wind and fog rolling in from the harbor, the scent of ash lingering from the foundries in South Boston. But by dawn, The whole city murmured one name. The widow had struck again. And this time, she had been seen clearly. The victim was Reverend Silas Dobson, 58, minister of the Unitarian congregation on Bowdoin Street. Beloved across classes, he preached temperance and purity with equal fervor. His sermon the week before had condemned women who mock providence through false science, pointedly referencing female reformers and nurse volunteers. He was found seated in his study chair, as though alive and meditating. A single violet rested on his open Bible. Harrow arrived within an hour of the discovery, beating even the constables. He watched as Dr. Leland bent to examine the body beneath the glow of gas lamps half suffocated with fog. Leland. No struggle, no poison we can trace. Heart simply ceased. Harrow. If preachers fall silent while quoting damnation, who'll be left to scold the living? Leland. Don't start your sermon. There's something under the nails. See that shimmer? He lifted Dobson's hand toward the light. Under each fingernail glittered a faint dusting of powdered glass. The same was found on the pages of Psalms 23, as if someone had handled them wearing glass-flecked gloves. Leland ordered samples preserved in sealed envelopes, but he already suspected their origin. The city's own infirmary, where powdered safety glass was used to disinfect surgical gloves between autopsies. That meant the murderer, or whatever walked their streets, had access to medical supplies, to training, perhaps to credentials, and to Leland's mounting dread. Only one such woman fit all three. Eleanor Vale. He said her name aloud then for the first time, quietly, almost reverently. Eleanor Vale. Harrow. Still chasing phantoms, Henry? Leland. Phantoms don't leave powder under a preacher's nail. The investigation that followed was the closest Boston came to hysteria since the witch trials of Salem. Every nurse became suspect, every widow a potential conspirator. Priests warned parishioners to avoid female visitors after dark. Funeral parlors locked their doors. City newspapers, once coy, turned bloodthirsty. The Morning Journal dubbed her Boston's Lilith. The Globe claimed, without proof, that she had seduced and killed 30 men across New England. The Herald printed a sketch. A tall woman in a black gown standing over a half-naked corpse, haloed by candlelight. Harrow hated the sensationalism but couldn't stay away. He wrote his own long exposé, The Widow of Joy Street, a study in stillness. Its measured prose lent the story legitimacy, and circulation soared. Leland, furious, confronted him in the newsroom one smoky evening. Leland, you make her myth larger with every line. Harrow, a myth doesn't hold glass powder and medical instruments. Leland, then print that instead of poetry. Harrow, readers won't believe plain fact, only haunting. They crave sin wrapped in lace. Their argument ended abruptly when a clerk handed over another letter. Ivory paper spelled with violet ink. The postmark bore no address. To Mr. Harrowone must love a city deeply to heal its diseases. You diagnose hysteria. I practice tranquility. You accuse mercy because you have never seen it unmasked. Attend St. Mary's morgue before dawn. There you will glimpse both salvation and its price. E.V. Leland ordered guards to the morgue immediately. Yet, by the time they arrived, the keeper found his keys already missing and the back door ajar. Inside, 4 bodies had been rearranged on steel tables, heads turned toward one another as though in conversation. Each wore a tiny scrap of silk pinned to the chest, forming together a single phrase, "May peace multiply." Nothing else was stolen, but the night watchman, found unconscious behind the furnace, muttered through cracked lips, "She thanked me for keeping the lamps dim." From that day, Boston transformed. People walked faster, speaking quieter, minds tilting inward. The newspapers printed diagrams of supposed routes the widow might take through the city, charting fog banks and alleys as if mapping weather patterns. The effect was intoxicating, a collective thrill stitched to terror. Even Harrow admitted later, she had become our reflection, the calm face hovering over our own restless guilt. Law enforcers from New York and Chicago were briefly consulted. They dismissed the case as a local delusion, but Leland persisted, chaining himself to duty as if penance. He spent days interviewing physicians, nurses, chemists, anyone with access to anesthetics or sedatives. Many remembered Eleanor Vale, though never by one consistent name. Some called her Dr. Claire Vane, others Mrs. E.V. Dupro. Always polite, always punctual, always paying in cash. One aging apothecary offered a clue. He swore she purchased chloroform and powdered opium late in '88, citing humanitarian experiments in end-of-life comfort. Her credentials, he said, were impeccable. When she had left his shop, she turned back and asked, "Do you believe quiet can be contagious?" The man thought it rhetoric, until her face appeared in every broadsheet. Suspicion ignited among Boston's ruling families. Wealthy households dismissed their maids. Hospitals fired female staff. The public began twisting every unexplained death into proof of the widow's omnipresence. A child died of pneumonia, and rumors claimed a woman in mourning had blessed her brow. A sailor drowned, and dockhands swore a veiled lady had watched from the pier, whispering, "Rest now." The hysteria soon turned toward Leland himself. Some accused him of incompetence, others of fascination bordering on complicity. "He dreams her path instead of tracking it," sneered a rival detective. Yet beneath his stern exterior, Leland felt something approaching reverence. Every time he reread her letters, always unsmeared, untraceable, he sensed intelligence, not madness, the kind that planned centuries rather than crimes. On June 3rd, a tremor in his methodical resolve appeared. He received a small package at his boarding house, addressed in violet ink. Inside was a silver pocket watch, his father's model, missing for years, and a note. "You keep time poorly, Henry. There are gentler measures." He smashed the watch but kept the note. That same week, Harrow arranged a clandestine interview with a woman claiming to be Eleanor Vale's former housemate. She met him by lantern light in the cemetery at Copp's Hill, appropriate, she said, since Miss Vale did her best thinking among bones. The woman, gaunt and nervous, recounted memories that blurred fact and superstition. Witness: "She spoke little of men, except in pity. I asked once if she'd ever loved. She replied, 'Only those I could not hurt.'" Harrow: "You believed she killed them?" Witness: "She said she healed them. Suffering is movement, she'd tell me. Peace requires stillness. But one night I woke and she was holding my wrist, counting the pulse with her lips." The witness fled the city soon after. Harrow believed her enough to dedicate his next column to psychology. He quoted European theorists on female hysteria and erotic melancholia, turning the newspaper into a medical salon. The article hinted that female desire suppressed too long might pervert into thanatolenia, the passion for death. Though couched in scholarly tone, readers devoured every line. Boston's coffeehouses erupted in debate. Was the widow insane, or the inevitable product of civilization's repression? Leland read it, disgusted that Harrow had named what the police couldn't yet prove. Still, the term echoed privately in his mind until it felt like confession. "What do you think?" Harrow posed publicly at the editorial meeting that month. "Guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here." The papers invited speculation. The city answered in fever. By midsummer, two events sealed the widow's legend. The first was the Rose Alley affair. On July 14th, an informant claimed Eleanor had been seen entering a disused apothecary behind Rose Alley. When constables burst in, they found walls lined with jars, each filled not with herbs, but preserved fragments, locks of hair, bits of clothing, and in one jar, the perfectly preserved hand discovered months earlier near the harbor, now floating in translucent fluid. Leland examined it silently, before whispering, like an experiment kept waiting for its report. Among the jars lay a ledger filled with names, mostly male, age, date, and a single line of comment, peace achieved by consent. Whether that consent existed was unknowable. Still, it made prosecution inescapable. The second event came 2 nights later. The fire at the old temperance clinic consumed an entire block. Witnesses saw a woman in black slipping through smoke to rescue patients, guiding them calmly into the street before disappearing into the flames. When firefighters entered the ruins, they found 2 bodies charred beyond recognition, one male, one female, and a melted brooch bearing the initials EV. Boston exhaled, half relieved, half sorrowful. Clergymen preached deliverance. Police closed their files. Leland refused to believe it. Something about the brooch bothered him. The clasp pattern belonged to a jeweler who'd lost his stockroom to theft earlier that month. Someone had staged a death convincingly. He reopened the case alone. The journalist and the detective. Once allies drifted apart, the former convinced the myth had ended in tragedy, the latter certain it had only changed costume. Harrow retreated to his notebook, writing words that would later appear in his memoirs. Perhaps we did not chase a woman at all, but a craving loosed upon creation, the elegant face we gave our own repression. Leland, meanwhile, traced new footprints. Murders, or rather, quiet endings, resumed by autumn across neighboring towns. Salem, Providence, Worcester. Always the same signature serenity, the single violet, the faint scent of chloroform that clung not to skin, but to bedsheets like perfume's ghost. He followed these clues to a remote cottage outside Dedham, where a widow calling herself Mrs. Claire Vane had been treating invalids with herbs. The local constable vouched for her kindness. Several patients indeed recovered, yet 2 died instantly after her visits, eyes blue-tinted, hearts placid. Enough pattern for suspicion. On October 1st, Leland at last obtained a warrant. Entering the cottage near dusk, he found rooms almost monastic, bare table, orderly shelves. A clock ticked evenly, echoing memories of Eleanor's father and his devotion to time. Upon the table sat an open medical text, margins filled with neat writing. To cure fear, end motion. A kettle hummed faintly. Then her voice from behind, calm as ever. Eleanor. Such persistence, Inspector. We might as well share tea. Leland. You've left the city bleeding fear. Eleanor. Fear precedes peace. You of all men understand restraint's sickness. Sit. I'll prove my medicine. He gripped his revolver, yet couldn't fire. Her presence disarmed more effectively than weapon or charm. She poured tea with a surgeon's steadiness. Through the steam, her eyes appeared luminous, reflective as her father's watch crystals. Eleanor, you chase me to punish mercy. I lay hands upon the dying when their cries reach God and are refused. Shall I watch them rot instead? Leland, they didn't choose you. Eleanor, all choose silence eventually. Her hand brushed the teacup toward him. He smelled chloroform laced with laudanum and struck the cup aside. She neither flinched nor fled, merely smiled as though his reaction proved her faith. Leland, you're under arrest for murder. Eleanor, then arrest your city, Inspector. It bred me. Before he could respond, she pulled a hidden vial from her sleeve and dashed it against the lamp. The ensuing smoke choked the room and extinguished light entirely. When officers rushed in minutes later, they found Leland unconscious but alive. Eleanor escaped, leaving behind only her gloves draped across the table beside a single dried violet. The incident granted her myth eternal life. To the press, she became not a criminal, but a fable, Boston's haunting personified, half victim, half temptress. Some said she fled to Europe. Others claimed her body surfaced in the Merrimack. Yet, wherever unnatural calm followed catastrophe, someone wrote her name anew. Harrow concluded his final editorial with words that read like epitaph and prophecy both. Perhaps Eleanor Vale was never one woman but the echo of all who have been told to keep still. When that silence snapped, it spoke in the only language our prudence could understand: death. Boston, once certain of its moral altitude, now trembled in self-recognition. Respectability had birthed its own nightmare. And somewhere beyond the city's glow, beneath a foreign sky or behind it another alias, the widow prepared her final art, one that would pluck the last thread between devotion and damnation. October 6th, 1889. The morning broke colorless, as if the sky itself had taken fright. Boston's harbor steamed like a cauldron, and the air smelled of salt and industrial soot, an odor of metal and endings. Detective Leland, gaunt from sleepless nights, stooped over a letter delivered by a trembling errand boy. The handwriting was unmistakable, disciplined, elegant, precise. "There is one last patient who seeks peace, Inspector. I will wait at the Vale workshop, where time first learned stillness. Bring your faith, not your firearm. E.V." The Vale workshop stood as a ruin on North Margin Street, once his father's watchmaker's den, a place of infinitesimal gears and unending ticking. It had been shuttered nearly 2 decades. Leland pocketed the note and prepared as for confession. This time, he told no one. Inside, dust thickened the air into amber haze. Hundreds of dismantled clocks hung from nails, their faces staring in petrified synchrony. Only one ran, a large regulator hanging crookedly on the wall, its pendulum sweeping a perfect heartbeat. And there she was. Eleanor Vale stood behind the counter as if she had never left, a single gas lamp painting her outline in trembling gold. No veil now, just the calm, unguarded face of a woman who had abandoned disguise. Beneath her hands lay notebooks, sealed jars, and a row of surgical instruments polished to blinding shine. "Leland, you chose this place for sentiment?" "Eleanor, for origin. Every child returns to the cradle before death." "Leland, you imagine this meeting ends your work." "Eleanor, it begins yours. I kept you alive because you too suffer noise. You think your duty redeems it. It does not." She motioned toward a shape on the floor, something draped in linen. He hesitated, then drew the cloth away. A man's corpse, meticulously arranged, lay displayed as if for study. Face serene, eyes half closed, lips parted in faint breathlessness. A mirror beside the corpse reflected both figures, the woman luminous beside her still companion, the detective dim behind them. "Eleanor. He was a murderer, Inspector, suffocated his wife, confessed to none. You should thank me for sparing the rope the strain." "Leland, you decide who sleeps? You believe yourself instrument of Providence." "Eleanor, Providence consults me nightly. It calls itself longing." She turned then, revealing a small brass syringe glinting between her fingers. From a nearby jar rose the scent of laudanum and ether mingled, a sweetness that burned the eyes. "Eleanor, do you know what laudanum truly is? Mercy distilled. The church anoints bodies with oil. I prefer clarity." Her tone was sermon and science entwined. To Leland's sensorium, the moment stretched into a nightmare of geometry. Pendulum, syringe, lamplight, each moving upon its axis to some secret metronome. He realized then that her philosophy was not chaos, but composition. every death an orchestration of motion collapsing into rest. She killed not for pleasure, but for perfection. When he raised his pistol, she smiled, rueful. "Eleanor, shoot, and remember, you destroy not evil, but emblem. The pulse you worship will continue breaking itself against the hours." He fired once. The lamp shattered. Darkness poured in as if blood could be shadow. Something struck his shoulder. Pain and chloroform tangled. A struggle, brief, blind, intimate, then silence. When consciousness returned, Leland found himself tied to the chair once belonging to Francis Vale, ropes knotted with surgeon's precision. The room glowed dim again, the regulator clock still ticking. Across from him stood Eleanor, unhurried, tending to a row of tiny files. She had bled from a minor wound in her shoulder but seemed unconcerned. Her own mortality, another experiment. "Eleanor, I wanted witness, Henry. All art requires one." Leland, "Call it what it is, a slaughter." Eleanor, "Slaughter screams, mine persuades." From her coat pocket she drew the silver watch she had once mailed to him. Its glass sphere now cracked. Nevertheless it ticked. 2 uneven beats. She held it near his ear. "Eleanor, hear that? The heart's imitation. The world runs on false rhythms. We live addicted to continuance when cessation is the original miracle." She approached, syringe poised. Leland, dizzy from fumes, whispered through clenched teeth. "Leland, then stop yourself." Eleanor, "I will, when the lesson is complete." And she pressed the needle not into him, but into her own arm. He gasped as she depressed the plunger, her expression one of pure contemplation. "Eleanor, this will bring stillness nearer. If Providence admires courage, let it consider mine." Within seconds her knees folded. She slid down beside the corpse, head resting upon the other's chest, as though listening for proof of quiet. Her final words were so faint, Leland scarcely knew if he heard them or dreamt them. "Stay until silence ripens." The clocks began to falter one by one, springs surrendering, ticks staggering. Leland somehow wriggled free, stumbled into the midnight street, and called for help that never arrived fast enough. When constables entered the workshop, they found scatterings of journals, the extinguished lamp, and 2 bodies, one ancient murderer, one immaculate woman, laid together like marital icons. Her pulse was gone. But death with Eleanor Vale refused to stay linear. The autopsy conducted under Dr. Ballard 3 days later recorded inconsistent phenomena. Rigidity set in, then lifted. Her pupils remained responsive to light for almost an hour. Ballard, shaken, wrote privately that the specimen exhibited voluntary calm beyond any displayed by the living. The body was claimed by no kin, buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Hope, under the generic headstone EV. That, officially, should have been the end, yet the aftermath grew stranger than the career that preceded it. The notebooks taken from the workshop unveiled meticulous transcriptions. Names, causes of suffering, doses administered, pulse counts before and after death. Interspersed with the data were fragments written like psalms. Stillness is divinity rehearsed. The pulse is fear counting itself. Love and chloroform both dissolve defiance. Medical men split over interpretation. Some decried insanity. Others privately admitted awe at her anatomical precision. Harvard's department archived the notes under Pathological Morality, Case E. A century later, scholars would rename them the Vale Papers. But immediate, 1889 Boston only saw blasphemy. Pulpit after pulpit thundered against unnatural science. Laid beneath each sermon throbbed a warning about ungoverned womanhood. The newspapers printed lurid sketches of her final scene, the widow of Joy Street embracing a corpse as clocks bled time, Mothers dragged daughters from chemistry lectures, muttering, "See what happens when curiosity forgets God." And yet, in quieter quarters, letters arrived at editorial offices signed anonymously by women who wrote, "She spared them. We understand." Harrow attended the inquest, taking notes the way a mourner might finger rosary beads. What he saw unsettled him more than anybody. A city eager to close the book, even while addicted to its pages. Afterward, he walked the harbor each night, half expecting to glimpse her silhouette among ship masts. One fog-heavy dawn, he did. Or thought he did. A woman stepped briefly into a shaft of lamplight, face veiled, hand gloved. When he called out, she vanished like steam. He returned home and began writing his final chronicle, a manuscript that would remain unpublished for decades. In it, he confessed, Eleanor Vale was not abolished. She diffused. The air of Boston carries her now, the tranquil pulse that follows horror, the hush after confession. She is peace mistaken for mercy, mercy mistaken for love. Years later, rumors persisted that the grave-marked EV was empty. Gravediggers whispered that, days after interment, the soil had been disturbed from below, not above. No one proved it, but on the anniversaries of certain unsolved deaths, a drowning here, a morphine overdose there, violets appeared on tombstones across the city, color dulled but unmistakable. Some said Leland left them, a penitent gesture from the man who shot too late. Others maintained the widow still walked, patient and invisible, waiting for the next restless soul who mistook endurance for virtue. The theology of her crimes divided thinkers long after the last headline yellowed. Moralists declared her punishment divine. Philosophers saw in her the embodiment of the fin de siècle trance, that thin line between science's promise and mysticism's hunger. Was she monstrous or prophetic? Each generation rewrote her diagnosis according to its own neuroses. In 1893, the psychiatrist Dr. Gustav Reinhardt cited her case when defining what he called thanatic ecstasis, ecstasy through annihilation. He wrote, "In Miss Vale we perceive a civilization simultaneously fleeing and desiring its own extinction, a feminine sibyl interpreting progress as disease." The phrase spared Boston's conscience, turning a murderess into symptom, and the city slept easier. But Harrow's surviving pages paint a subtler horror. When I look upon an ordinary deathbed now, I wonder whether her hand hovers unseen, coaxing the moment gentler. We thanked her once by name. We still thank her when we anesthetize pain. The night before his retirement, Detective Leland visited Mount Hope Cemetery. The caretaker noted he carried no flowers. He simply stood before the headstone, rain soaking his coat, until midnight. Then he laid upon the earth his father's stopped watch, the same broken one she had returned to him, and whispered something the caretaker could not hear. By dawn, the watch had vanished. He never spoke of her again, yet colleagues swore that in his final years he refused to wind any clock. Noise, he said, is what keeps guilt breathing. Boston moved on, rebuilding its respectability brick by brick. The technological century dawned. Telephones, electric bulbs, anesthesia adopted widely in hospitals. Critics later claimed irony. The very chemical that enabled painless surgery had once been her sacrament. Doctors forgot her name, though her method, gentle oblivion, gas and calm, became medicine's daily miracle. The widow had succeeded beyond her dreams. She taught civilization to kill pain politely. If you stood in that workshop today, in the renovated district now gleaming with offices, you'd hear nothing but the faint ticking of modern clocks through thin walls. Yet sometimes, just before closing, workers swear an impossible fragrance seeps through their vents, half ether, half violet. They laugh, pocket their watches, and hurry home before the second hand halts mid-stroke. And somewhere, perhaps buried, perhaps dispersed in the city's breath. A calm voice whispers to anyone listening too intently, "Rest, be still." If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Boston awoke from its nightmare as if from a fever, drenched, trembling, pretending it was cured. By the winter of 1890, the newspapers had folded the widow's tale between political scandals and shipping reports, yet her ghost remained laced through ordinary speech. Any death deemed painless was dubbed a veil passing. Undertakers all but marketed the phrase. Government records tell a story even bleaker. Causes of death reports across Massachusetts that year suddenly blossomed with a new euphemism: applied anesthesia. Doctors adopted chloroform not only in surgery but to relieve terminal agony. Reformers hailed it as progress. No one mentioned whose example pioneered the practice. The city would not say her name, yet its hospitals echoed her creed, that peace might, in the right hands, be manufactured. In the courtrooms, the matter lingered like a bad scent. The inquest into Eleanor Vale's acts lasted 14 days, though the accused was a corpse. Judge Pemberton, weary of reporters rifling through evidence notes, declared the case closed by natural and moral exhaustion. Still, the testimonies transcribed there shaped early debates on medical ethics. Scholars cited them decades later when arguing over a physician's right to hasten death. Few remembered how a woman's scandal had gestated that argument in whispered horror. Detective Leland submitted one final report before resignation. In his concluding lines, he wrote with austere simplicity, "Peace is contagious. May the Lord contain it before it consumes the living." He vanished from public life thereafter, dying in obscurity inside a veterans' asylum in 1901. Nurses claimed he begged nightly for clocks to be stopped at his bedside. James Harrow, meanwhile, found unwanted fame. His serialized account of the widow's deeds was reprinted in London and New York, celebrated as journalism, condemned as pornography. He spent the next decade lecturing on the psychology of tranquil crime, forever uneasy when audiences applauded at the wrong moments. Toward the end, he confessed to an interviewer, "We made her eternal by printing her. She murdered a few. I resurrected her endlessly." Public sentiment swung like a pendulum between horror and secret admiration. Among working-class women, her story mutated into legend, part caution, part liberation. Some whispered prayers for the widow's soul alongside those for their own stillborn infants. Others wore tiny, violet brooches hidden under plain collars, tokens of rebellion disguised as mourning. The church condemned the fashion, which practically guaranteed its success. The wider world caught Boston's contagion of introspection. Pamphlets on moral anesthesia circulated through theological colleges. Medical journals printed uneasy essays about the moral frontier between alleviating pain and annihilating it. Strangers who had never seen her face debated her motives by candlelight. Even Frederick Law Olmsted, superintendent of park design, wrote privately that the city's mania for order has found its most perfect emblem, a woman who tidied the dying. Perhaps the worst consequence came not from crimes themselves, but from the silence that followed. When society decided never again to speak the phrase, "she couldn't climax unless they were dead," it also decided never again to discuss female desire at all. Ministers who once blamed hysteria replaced the word with melancholy, physicians with nervous exhaustion. Meanwhile, institutions quietly expanded wards for women suffering from what they now called valenism, a nervous longing for stillness. The term endured decades, its origin politely forgotten. Factories ticked on. The age of electricity dawned. By 1905, anesthetics had become modern wonder, advertised in bright posters where even children smiled in mock surgery scenes. Progress stood triumphant, luminous, self-satisfied. But if one listened closely to that triumph, behind the hum of new turbines murmured a familiar sermon. Pain must end. Motion must yield to mercy. Boston had transmuted her sin into utility. Out in Mount Hope Cemetery, by then nearly swallowed by vines, children from nearby cottages sometimes sneaked among the stones to play hide-and-seek. They said a faint chiming always answered their laughter, though no bell was visible. Each year on All Souls' Eve, the caretaker discovered a small bundle laid at the foot of the unmarked grave. A violet, a pair of gloves, and sometimes a watch stopped forever at 12 o'clock. He filed no reports. Certain stories, once buried, prefer shallow soil. Ultimately, the widow's truest monument was invisible, a shift in the conscience of a people who had long confused virtue with stillness. She forced Boston, rigid, reverent, choking under its own restraint, to confront what sleep it secretly envied. The city learned to decorate death until it sparkled like faith. In doing so, it ensured her victory. Time keeps its covenants, even with the damned. The name Eleanor Vale has faded to dust on untraceable parchments, yet Boston's heartbeat still carries her tempo, brisk industry muffling forbidden longings, mercy dressed as efficiency. Every anesthetist who stills a body before the scalpel, every mourner who whispers rest instead of live, moves, however unconsciously, to her design. Perhaps the widow of Joy Street never sought to end lives so much as to prove control was an illusion. The more the city chased silence, the louder its clocks became. In the end, she turned that ticking into prayer. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled or carefully buried to protect the powerful and their appetites? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Together, we'll keep listening for the shadows time thought it had silenced.